Hi, everyone. Welcome to Writing Stories with Ellen Spilsbury. That's me. The LM stands for Louise Marie, and Kimberly D. Tate.
Hello.
This week, we thought we would talk about why we write. I was thinking about this yesterday as I was watching yet another um, video about the COVID experience and the science behind it and the cultural repercussions over the last 2 years, 3 years. This is something that I've become almost addicted to. I initially started, I initially started down this route because um, the writing that I do, and I state this on my website, is that I am really interested in societies under pressure, as well as the many faces of love. But I never expected to live through a period where our society was under so much pressure, and not only our society, but the whole world. The whole world right now is just in upheaval.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it made me think, so why is it that in my writing, I need to be able to include in the background kind of a social commentary on the times in which we live? And it's worked in really well because it just happened that the topic of my books is all about um, genetically modified humans in 100 years that are being produced for their immune systems that can be harvested to protect people from pandemic diseases. And so the whole COVID thing kind of fell in my lap because it just
Did.
happened to mesh with this um, idea that I had several years before COVID, and which I've been working on in my Modified Human series, also called my Immunity Books. And um, for me, writing is, I think, a much more cerebral exercise than it is for many novelists. Kim can talk to you a little bit about her writing, which tends to be a very spiritual and creative process of coming up with great characters and neat ideas and connecting the dots to make a story. Whereas mine is very much about characters that I love, but situations that um, reflect a great deal of real life and that explore the kinds of conflicts that people would be faced with put in these situations. And I've certainly been in a conflict situation over the past couple of years because I've lost friends during COVID. Um, I felt a lot of strain between people who are close to me for my views because I've studied the science so carefully, and it tends to be at odds with the mainstream narrative. So it's created a great deal of stress in my life, and how to incorporate that into my stories while still making my characters sympathetic and the situations they're in interesting and um, not alienating to people has been a really long journey in a way.
Yeah.
And mesh all this with just having to write a good story, having to come up with a story arc that works, and with characters that are interesting and believable, especially in these very unusual settings that I've created where we suddenly have people created out of test tubes, which I don't think will ever happen. I don't think we'll ever be stitching a genome together from scratch. But hey, in my 100 years, that's what I've done. And just to show that genetic engineering isn't perfect, only a few of their creations really meet their full expectations. So I guess I've been rambling a bit. I hope this makes a little bit of sense. But why I write is kind
You
of, for
have something
me,
to say.
uh, I have something that I want to say, and it's a very kind of analytical process. And one of the great joys in writing for me is to create the perfect blend of words that precisely reflects what the thought in my mind is. And if I can put a bit of poetry and imagery in that, that's so much the better. But anyways, Kim, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you write?
Why do I write? I've thought a lot about this, and you know how some people are sort of called to do missionary work, or they're called to the ministry, or there's just a real sense of where they belong in this world. And for me, I think writing is sort of a calling, and it's something that I sort of can't not do. And my mind is always coming up with these ideas and story ideas and characters and scenes in my head. And if I don't get them out of my head, then they start to drive me insane. So my way of sort of finding my way through the world is to write about it, and it's more of a therapeutic thing for me. But I also get to create good characters and interesting characters, and it's a little bit like putting a puzzle together and fitting everything in so that it works, and sometimes it fails miserably, as as we know. But yeah, it's kind of like I just sort of can't not write. It's maybe a little bit of an obsession with me as well. And, I want to do a good job. So I've, spent many, many years learning the craft and learning how to put a story together. But yeah, for me, it's something that I sort of can't not do. So I guess you could call it a bit of an obsession, but that's why I write.
Well, it's interesting that you say that it's a calling, because when I was 5 years old, I had a vision. I woke up one morning and I just knew. I knew two things with utter certainty. One of them was that one day I would have a horse, and the other was that I would write a book. And I was so happy. So it's almost as if the timeline of my life got compressed in the middle so that I could see what would happen at the end. And both those things were things that filled me with joy. So in a way, I think it was predestined that I would be a writer. It just took me several decades to get there.
Sure, yeah.
But, yeah, so it's interesting how we all experience the world in different ways, isn't it?
Well,
It would be very interesting to know why other writers write.
Did you ever write stories when you were a kid? Like, did you ever just go off by yourself with a notepad and just write stories just for the heck of it?
Not really. I did do some writing, but it tended to be more beautiful paragraphs that were very poetic and talked about flowers and rainbows.
Yeah,
I didn't write stories. I was an avid reader, and for many, many decades, I was actually baffled as to how a story would come together. Mm-hmm. How did people think of all this stuff and end up with something that was so interesting in the end? So again, for me, it was a very cerebral, intellectual exercise to understand the crafting of a story. Mm-hmm. And even now, that's how I put a story together. It's a very cerebral exercise for me, rather than a spontaneous, oh wow, look at this.
Yeah,
which I think for you is really what it is, right?
Yeah. It's more of I'm a discovery writer, what they call discovery writers. I just kind of I create the characters and just let them go. Sometimes they try to go off.
Well, before we started. And that happens to me too, that sometimes I'll reach a point in the story where sometimes it just takes on a whole new direction because of something that the character said that I hadn't seen coming, or does that I hadn't seen coming. So it still happens to me as well, but the whole lens through which I experience it is, I think, very different than yours. Before we started recording today, we were talking about all this because you're working on your Cirque du Tarot book and have had some feedback from an editor, and I sense that you're sitting kind of overwhelmed as to what to do with all this feedback. And one thing I said to you was, well, maybe you need to see it as you just let her rip for the first draft. You just put it all down, and when it gets to the end, maybe that's when you have to sit back, get a bit of distance, and then have a look to see what is the skeleton or the outline of your story, and is there anywhere where it's maybe gone off on a tangent that wasn't necessary, or I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
That's a topic for another.
Before we started.
That's a topic for another day. Yeah.
That's a topic for another day. Anyways, I guess we'll just let it end here today. We don't want to belabor the point for our viewers. We want to thank you all very much for tuning in, and check in with us next week. We'll have something else to talk about. Bye for now.
I know.